Okay, well, obviously, welcome to this webinar. My name is Keith Deaney. I'm part of the Adris team. We are really a reseller of CAD software, but and in case you guys haven't sort of worked with us yet, or you've just sort of heard of this presentation through sort of emails or whatever, we started off doing reselling. I'll go into introductions properly about the company and stuff a bit more in a bit of detail in a minute, and likewise with myself really. But for the purposes today, I'm a BIM consultant, so obviously I work for Adris, part of their professional services team, and obviously really the webinar today was looking at an introduction to BIM overall. So sort of quite a sort of overview kind of webinar, not really going into the nuts and bolts of sort of programs or anything like that particularly, although I will sort of obviously mention from time to time things that we've used and so on. So, but obviously really the idea of today is to sort of give you an overview of BIM, what it is, how it's come about, why it's there, and how we sort of use it really. So. Firstly, obviously, just a quick introduction as to me, basically, and who I am, and why you might want to listen to me. So obviously, my name's Keith Deaney. I came from an architectural background. I've been with Adris now for 2 years. I trained in architecture and then worked in industry for sort of about 10 years or so, doing both sort of large, small-scale designs. And got involved in sort of three-dimensional design projects, rolling out coordinated three-dimensional design really, so kind of BIM, but before it was really named as kind of BIM, to be honest. And now in Adris, obviously I get involved in not only rolling out, software, hardware, training, that side of things, but also the kind of implementation, execution of BIM within side of practices, and sort of helping practices manage kind of BIM deployment within their environment. Also currently studying to do a BIM management MSc as well. So just trying to basically keep up to date with everything that's going on really with BIM. Obviously these sort of things move on so quickly, so trying to sort of keep abreast of everything that's going on really. And also active member of the South BIM Hub. So the central government have got BIM hubs in all different region areas. So if you are getting involved in BIM as a company, it'll probably be worth seeing where your local one of that is and seeing if you can attend. It's worthwhile. I mean, everybody who goes to these things is from all different, consultants, all different areas within inside the sort of fields of architecture, construction management, MEP structures. So it's not just sort of architectural led or anything, and it's worth going to them and just sort of discussing and seeing how other people are approaching these things. So Adris, obviously as I say, Adris initially was a reseller of Autodesk software, but now we're sort of a lot more than that really. So I mean, involved in all sorts of sectors, AEC wise, and manufacturing. Probably started out most in manufacturing really, with the kind of 2D stuff, and then sort of moving into 3D stuff as manufacturing kind of adopted more virtual 3D stuff. Whereas obviously now it's one of those things that AEC is sort of lagging behind a little bit when it comes to the AEC three-dimensional environment. But now we get involved obviously in some very large practices, and also go down to very small practices as well, giving a good package to all sorts of areas of both, as I say, sort of training, implementation, all of those sorts of things. And manufacturing wise, I mean, we still get involved in some big manufacturing companies as well, sort of helping them out. Mainly it's more sort of high level now. From a manufacturing point of view, it's more moved towards the kind of data management side. So from a sort of architectural AEC kind of point of view, why has BIM come about? Why do we need it? What is it? Probably one of the largest catalysts to BIM being instigated really in this country was the kind of government construction strategy, which was first published in 2011. In that there was lots and lots of talk about how the government wanted to progress, construction overall, but this particular sentence has been one that's sort of widely used now and picked out of all of that document as being the important part really when it comes to BIM. So obviously, you can read that just as well as I, but I mean really just obviously the adoption and utilising of building information modelling and technologies based around building information modelling, the processes, the collaborative behaviour, all of that sort of way of working was really part of that kind of strategy, and obviously that was initially designed for, as it says there, reducing the capital costs of large-scale capital projects, and in the construction strategy it was designed for large-scale construction projects. But as that become adopted by the larger organisations, it then fed down into the rest of the supply chain, so smaller companies who are involved in that as well. So just because it was originally capital projects of a certain size that were involved in government, but obviously that then sort of fed down into smaller, and obviously that's been a knock-on effect now over the last sort of 3 or 4 years, that people have now started seeing BIM as a kind of more of a process, and started adopting it throughout, not just in a kind of capital project based environment. So really, what does BIM mean? I mean, obviously BIM is just an acronym, and in architectural engineering environment, we love acronyms, same as everywhere else. Unfortunately, they're everywhere, and we have to use them all the time. But BIM, in that sort of sense, is just an acronym. And in a similar way, I think of CAD there, because obviously with CAD, again, obviously CAD is just an acronym, and it's one of those acronyms that means different things to different people. And everybody knows CAD, everybody uses the term CAD, everybody assumes that everybody means the same thing, but realistically it's one of those things that means different things to different people. Computer-aided drafting, computer-aided design, depending on what sort of field you're in, depends on how it's relevant to what you're doing. So likewise with BIM, really, I mean, BIM in its basic format obviously to most people means building information modelling, which is probably correct, but is it one model? Is it several buildings? Is it several models? Is it and to be honest, I mean, in my mind, it's more of a management of information, not just something that's modelled in a three-dimensional environment, but managing information. So you could suggest that it's actually building information management, which is the way I tend to think of it more, rather than just modelling. With the government construction strategy, they were sort of leading into more life cycle management as well. If I just go back to the previous slide there, the last line on that slide really is talking about working in all stages of project life cycle. So now we're sort of not just looking at building information modelling, but we're also looking at project life cycle management as well. Taking a model, handing it over at the end of the project to a client, and then that client taking it forward into the life cycle of that building, and having that as an asset to then manage through the life cycle of that building. So it's more about now leading into that project life cycle management. Obviously that's very difficult at the moment to understand how to do that, because the client needs to know what they need to have to manage whilst it's being designed, which has its own implications and its own issues. So it's something that we're still working on at the moment, but that's where we're sort of trying to lead towards, really, not just having standalone models from a kind of design and construction base. So what is building information modelling? Well, obviously the bits that we do know about it is that it's a form of digital prototyping in the sort of manufacturing sense. Obviously we're kind of digitally creating something on a computer, and obviously testing it, checking things in the design. We can test it against environmental aspects, needs of escape, smoke, ventilation, all of those sorts of things, and help basically design decisions as we go through. Building information modeling doesn't necessarily have to be 3D. I mean, it can be 2D graphical information. So even basic AutoCAD can still be, a form of building information modeling. It's the information you're taking out of it, it's not necessarily, how it's actually been drawn. Design visualization, well, obviously a little bit like the digital prototyping, the ability to create something on a computer means then that obviously you're then able to start visualizing it to a far greater degree. You can sort of see it in its environment, see the buildings around it, and obviously look at things to a far higher visualization level now. I mean, in our office we have a Studio Max team, so they do a lot of high-level visualizations so that clients, customers, whatever, can kind of see projects to a far higher level of visualization. Very realistic, images now are being created so that people can actually see what the building's going to look like before such times, obviously, anything gets dug in the ground. And then obviously, virtual design and construction. So again, a little bit similar really, but obviously virtually designing something, constructing it. You can go through obviously the stages of being, the actual building being constructed. You can organise it against a Gantt chart or program and start seeing how the building's being built. There's lots and lots of aspects to it now, and people are starting to do more than just basically model something on a computer. They'll start to say, okay, we've got all this information, what can we actually do with it and how can we use it? So obviously, why BIM? Apart from the construction strategy, obviously another sort of important kind of slide that people tend to use a lot is really just trying to, express the difference between something that's being utilized as a building information model that's being added to through the process of, like this slide sort of demonstrates, planning, design and construction, rather than having things like standalone type drawings that you might be doing on something like AutoCAD or SketchUp or whatever. So, in this you might, the sort of planning, the white line that steps up and then drops back down again to the blue line and then drops back down to the blue and drops back down to the blue, and then you've got eventually that sort of arrow, really sort of suggests that, information is being utilized at a planning stage. Something's being very swiftly designed, it's going in planning, some of that information is getting lost, redrawn, going through a design stage, again, some, it's going into building regulations, whatever, it's then, again, some of the information is getting lost, having to be redrawn, and then there's construction stage and so on. So that kind of step down each time, the information being lost each time, is suggesting that each time that loss is applied, then obviously there's a loss also of time and money, for them people obviously having to redraw and redo all of those things again. So that kind of exhaustive work really, whereas obviously the whole point of the building information modelling sort of system really as a process is to basically take that information, utilise it at each process, basically build it up as you kind of go, so that obviously you're not losing information and therefore obviously not losing time and money through the kind of process of the, the completion of the design and then obviously the build on site. Other sort of drivers for utilising BIM, well obviously, urbanisation, towns, cities getting larger and more demand for housing and, business stock and so on. Natural resources, obviously the depletion of everybody's aware of, obviously our resources are getting used up, and therefore obviously design is trying to be more intelligent, so people are trying to, environmentally design now, which again, to sort of test all of those things. BIM is a very good way to kind of design something, like I was saying earlier, virtually construct something and test it against the kind of requirements that a company might have for the environmental aspects of it, the CO2 emissions, the insulation levels, whether it's going to have heat sources, heat losses, passive solar heat gain, all of those sorts of things. So people are also using it for a kind of the competition thing. Well, that's really just more that obviously people are now using BIM and the processes that's involved with BIM as a to try and get the edge, if you like, on competitors, and basically trying to utilise BIM technology to then start doing more and more with it and say, yes, okay, yes, we can do BIM, but we can also do high-level visualizations, we can also do programming, we can also do timelining. So there's a sort of all the Ds that's been branded around, the sort of 3Ds, 4Ds, 5Ds of sort of time and money, and basically starting to apply lots and lots of different things once you've actually got that modelling done in a kind of computer environment. Complexity of models as well. I mean, likewise with the kind of natural resources thing that I was talking about, obviously trying to make something environmentally friendly, but also, buildings now are a lot more complex when it comes to lighting design and things like acoustics and the understanding of how technology is involved in different aspects of a building. And then obviously, that feeds onto the technology one at the bottom there as well. So, again, obviously people want rooms to be more intelligent, so light switch on, light switch off, they might want to see different light moodings and all of those sorts of things you can start feeding into the kind of building information model. This really was just to sort of suggest, obviously, how things have been adopted so far, really. So initially, as we can see here, we're sort of talking about 2009 to kind of projected to 2014 here with these kind of three levels for each of the disciplines here. So initially, we can see in sort of 2009 that BIM was adopted widely by architects. Some engineers, some contractors, and the least by sort of owners and clients. Now, particularly, we're seeing quite a shift in that, and contractors and owners now are beginning to have a far greater understanding of what BIM is and how it can work for them. And particularly when it comes to contractors now are wanting to utilise the BIM models to apply into, like I think, say things like timelining, Gantt charts, see how things are going to be organised on site. So you might be in London and have a very, very restrictive site, so the contractor might want to know how things are going to be coming in and out of that site, times of day that things need to be applied, where the cranes are going to be sited. All of those sorts of things can then be starting to be applied by utilising the BIM that's been created. So obviously there you can see the steepest climb really is now going to be projected for contractors and owners. Obviously architects and engineers, again, likewise, are still obviously adopting BIM as the process goes on. A little bit the same really. This was just sort of talking about, so this was using the National Building Specifications report that they produce every year, and then they sort of talk about how BIM is being adopted. They ask questions to a vast array of architects, engineers, contractors, all sorts of different people in the field, and basically sort of see how people are understanding and adopting these things. So obviously, again, you can see sort of 2012 to 2013, the confidence in what BIM is and how it's being utilised is increasing. People are, initially in sort of 2009, 2010, 2011, were sort of thinking, well, there's this thing, do we want it? Do we need it? Do we use it? Is it going to be the future? There's all these kind of questions about BIM and what it was, whereas now it's one of those things that people are kind of just assuming that's really the way that we're going. So it's kind of just been adopted now, really. And likewise, obviously the projected uses of BIM as well, really, within practice. So obviously it's quite useful to see how things are increasing there, that people are expecting to be using it within certain time frames, and that's obviously increasing over the time of year on year, really. So one of the main differences between BIM and more sort of traditional ways of producing drawings and documentation really was, the way I see it is it's a kind of cultural change, and there obviously is a massive difference between the way that you're producing something like a BIM, building information model or models, in comparison to just producing A2 drawings in a kind of A1, A3 kind of format. So there's a big shift really in the way that the things are being produced. Originally, CAD particularly was very documentation driven. People were always producing something, a set of sheets. Those sets of sheets were then obviously sent or emailed or whatever, PDF'd to other contractors and other consultants to then look at, comment on, send back. So everything was all based around the kind of documentation. Everything was led from the documentation. Everything was always based around those sheets. Whereas now, with BIM, it's more of a design-led thing. You design something from the very first instances. You design something in a three-dimensional environment, and it's the model that then sort of creates everything. That model is the design. It is creating then eventually the documentation. The documentation, really, the sheets, if you like, that come out of it are just one small aspect of what's being produced out of the building information model. And that's really the major difference, is that now we don't think about BIM as being an A3 or an A4 sheet or an A1 sheet or a set of sheets. It's the model. Everything in its entirety is all contained there. The sheets are just a small part of that. Things like schedules are also obviously a part of that, and then, as I say, feeding into other areas as you kind of go as well. So, you know, it's a lot of movement from this kind of way of thinking and the way of documentation, and thinking of something as a kind of designed entity, and that entity then obviously producing lots of other, you know, aspects as it goes, including obviously the documentation. Also in a practice, obviously the deployment and then the implementation of BIM within a practice has a big change and a big impact on the people that's there. You could break this down into sort of three areas, really: the people that's involved, the technology that's involved, and the process that those people are adopting within that technology, obviously to collaborate with everybody else. Realistically, it's not really kind of three equal parts. It's more a case of the process being the important aspect. The process is key. Collaboration and building information modelling is all about collaborating, and that collaborative process is the key part, really. People understanding how other consultants they're working with, the contractor they're working with, all of those sort of things, how each of those aspects are working and how those processes can work together is the important part. People would be the next biggest one, really, because of obviously the aspect that people need to want to adopt these things. People need to understand the processes that's involved and feel that they are involved in those processes. You know, feel that it's not just a case of that's it, things are changing. More feel that they're a part of those, you know, that cultural change and that cultural shift as the processes in an office or whatever environment kind of change. Technology really is a small one in that sort of respect, really, because obviously the technology is just a tool. The software, the infrastructure, the hardware that you use, it's got to be right for the job, but it's not as important as the process and the people that are involved in it. And it is just there as a go-between, if you like, and a way of producing that kind of process that you want to adopt. With the construction strategy, after that was produced, this kind of image has been now adopted by a lot of people, and it's an image that you will see in many slides in many different presentations for BIM. I'm using it here really not just to kind of follow suit, but really because it is one that people do tend to see a lot, and it is a little bit of a complex slide from my point of view, really, but it does explain very well, obviously, the kind of steep learning curve and the steep kind of process that goes into moving from one aspect of producing inside of an office to another. Right at the bottom of that sort of steep climb, obviously you've got the kind of CAD-based system, which is kind of broken down to a level 0. Obviously running along the top there, we can see all the different levels. That construction strategy really wants to move everybody by 2016 to be in that level 2 band. So everybody really needs to be level 2 BIM by 2016. That's the kind of branding that's been publicised very widely over the last particularly over the last year and a half to 2 years now. So really what that means is obviously shifting from that kind of level 0, that CAD-based system, through level 1 and into level 2. A lot of people are doing that. They're kind of moving from one to the other as they go. So they're kind of using their 2D systems, starting to adopt a degree of 3D, then starting to use BIM a bit more, then starting to sort of work in BIM more and more frequently, starting to leave the kind of CAD-based systems a bit more behind. You know, it is a progressive thing. It's not a case of jumping from one thing to another. But really, obviously, what we're aiming towards is, you know, in that level 3, we can see there, obviously, you've got the life cycle management. So, you know, intelligent BIM, BIM as it's called there, and then life cycle management, and kind of basically having a whole project life cycle of a building information model. I think that also sort of goes hand in hand with the bit underneath, where you've just got sort of drawings, lines, arcs, and circles. You know, everything in CAD is very basic information. There's nothing there that contains anything of real importance. Each part is just a line, just a bit of text. Whereas with a building information model, the whole point is that everything is collaborative. So you're requiring structure from the structures guys, you're acquiring the architectural information from the architects guys, you know, you're linking all of those things together. You can see one in the other, you can, you know, interrogate it, find out things about it. You know, it's all a lot more intelligent than just having basic, you know, lines, arcs, etc. So obviously it's a big shift. I'll come back to that slide probably a bit later on. So the other thing as well is with that collaborative workflow, obviously another thing that's been sort of branded around, it's a little bit of an Americanization really, which is IPD, or Integrated Project Delivery, which basically means that instead of everybody working in kind of silos, as they get called nowadays, so you have a contractor, an architect, an engineer, each of those in their own little space, doing their own little bit to a project. So instead of having each of those individual silos, the idea of the integrated system is that obviously everybody's working together. We are kind of in one big bubble together, trying to create, you know, one single project together, which, you know, in a utopian world, obviously would be fantastic. And in real terms, obviously, it doesn't quite work like that. But more and more people are now trying to incorporate things like it says there, more of the supply chain at an earlier stage. Trying to also communicate a lot better. So at the start of a BIM project, have a kind of collaborative meeting, you know, have a sit down with everybody who's on the kind of team and sort of say, you know, what can we do? How can we work this? What's the process that we'll kind of be going through as this kind of BIM project, and trying to ensure that everybody's along, you know, on the same page really, and everybody's working along the same sort of lines, and that things can be shared accurately and in the correct manner. Because obviously if people are using different platforms, if people are using different ways of producing drawings, and different ways of modelling the information, then how that interoperability between those programs is going to be managed and who's going to be managing it is obviously key. So really it's just about communication, and a lot of that communication is now starting to happen earlier on in the project before things happen, basically. Obviously BIM as well, you know, like I said, initially the BIM was a bit of a kind of, is it something that's going to be adopted? Is it going to be, you know, the next big thing? Do we need to worry about it? All of those sort of things, all of those kind of questions are sort of being answered now, really. And the fact that people like the RIBA, the CIC as well, the Construction Industry Council, are all kind of starting to look at how, you know, the BIM stages are working. The RIBA obviously changing things like their plan of works to now take into account the BIM stages and work with the CIC about the BIM stages is a fundamental thing, really. The RIBA don't like, you know, changing their stages of works, but they've massively changed them now, and they've only changed them because of the fact that BIM is being adopted so largely. And these stages of works now are sort of, you know, leading to collaborative working, that IPD method that I've got there, and allowing for things like what are called data drops. So obviously trying to have these stages now allowing for the ability of a model being produced, a degree of that data being dropped out of the model, sent to everybody for information, and then sort of almost archived, if you like, a sort of hold point of the project, and then moving to the next stage, and then the next stage as things go. So, you know, overall, obviously, it's a big shift in the way that you know, things like the plan of works now has obviously instigated that shift into the workflow that people are using, that kind of procurement strategy that people are now adopting. This levels document as well, this levels drawing really leads into the documents as well that's needed, the documentation that goes with this. Obviously, yes, it's great having a building information model, and that model is a degree of information, but alongside of that, you need some sort of documentation to organise that model, understand, and be able to allow people to collaboratively work, for people to be able to share information. Obviously, that information has got to be like for like created, or otherwise nobody's going to understand what anybody else has created. So the government are producing at the moment a lot of documents as well to go alongside of these things. The biggest ones really at the moment are the British standards that's been updated. So in there you can see the standards, the BS 1192s. They are past documents at the moment. So there's a past 1192-1, 2 and 3 now, which all kind of handle different areas of collaborative working in a kind of BIM environment. And there's also British standards there that's about kind of modelling creation, family creation, that sort of thing. And then we are now trying to work into things like the kind of uniclass formats, and things like MBS are now adopting the uniclass system as well, so that everybody's going to be starting, you know, again, working in the same sort of way. The kind of workflow is different as well now. A lot of it is the same as before. You know, there's still contract documents, there's still, you know, employers' information requirements, there's still scopes of services. All of those are exactly the same, but some of it has been kind of added to, really. I mean, in the standards for practice there, you can see obviously you've got your kind of plan of works, but you've also got things like COBie that people are now starting to work towards, which I'll get on to in a minute. In the contract documents, obviously you've got things like protocols as well that people are starting to utilise, which again I'll go on to in a minute. And then also there's more sort of project specifics that as you instigate a new project, as you implement a new project, the past documents I just mentioned, so the 1192s might come into that, but also you've got things like the BEPS, or building information modelling execution plans that people use, and the master information delivery protocols that people use, and there's lots of different systems for that as well. So I'll just start talking about those a little bit. As I say, I mean, probably the first and most important document to read really when it comes to BIM is probably the past documents, which in essence were based on the old British standards, the old BS 1192 2007 ones, which really kind of started to deal with collaborative working when it comes to just basic 2D information. The past documents now are trying to basically build on that and talking about maybe even larger, more complex projects, but mainly about projects obviously in a kind of building information modelling sense. So, as I say, the past 1192s are the important ones. We've also got things like the BIM protocols as well, so how you're managing things inside of an office, and how you're going to manage things when it comes to the contract documents. So the CIC BIM protocol is a kind of link to your contract documents. The AEC BIM protocol is more about how you're kind of deploying something inside of an office, really. The CPICS BIM assessment documents really are, they were produced originally in part with Skanska, and then they've now, central government have now put them up on their task group websites. They're basically kind of an aid to communication, really. The idea being that as you implement a new BIM project and you're getting involved in a new BIM project, you would use the assessment documents, and you may be asked to fill them out, or you may be filling them out or sending them to somebody else to fill out. And the idea really of them is to get an understanding as to how everybody's working. So a little bit like that thing I was talking about earlier about the processes, just to understand the processes that people work towards, what experience people have got, what programs they're using, how they go about things. All of those sorts of things are assessed in those documents, and it's just a way of communicating back to each other where you're at, how you're going about things, so that then people can start working those things together properly to then obviously come up with some sort of unilateral methodology as to the process that you're going to be adopting when it comes to BIM instigation inside of a project. The British standard document originally, the BS 1192-2007, was really talking about, as I say, the kind of collaborative working when it comes to 2D based design. 2D, 3D makes no difference. The principles are still going to be exactly the same. The main part that it was talking about that's important to us now really is the kind of collaborative way of working when it comes to a common data environment. This is really starting to talk about production of information by different design teams. So, you know, whether it was an architect, structural engineer, and a MEP consultant, for example, you know, each of those will be producing a work in progress set of documents. Those would then be shared to a shared environment, a common data environment. And then at some point there would be an authorization, a kind of tick off of that and say, yeah, that information is good. In essence, we used to call them statuses. So obviously that status would then get changed to being, you know, approved, as it were. And then that documentation would then obviously be produced, and things like drawing sheets or whatever would be produced out of that. So really, whether it's 2D or 3D, it makes no difference at all. And that kind of work in progress, sharing the information, authorizing, publishing, and then eventually archiving that information is the kind of key, you know, 4-step process that we're talking about. And obviously, basically, you can just keep, you know, looping around that sort of process every time you have a new project, really. The British standards that's been updated now, the new PASS documents, the PASS 1192-2 is probably the design one and based mostly for what we're talking about here, is using that same system. So obviously you can see in the middle of that slide there is that same BS 1192-2007 4-step system. But we're also kind of adding to that really, and obviously having things like the employer's information requirements, the appointment documents, if you like, and also the fact that once something's been published, there may be a necessity to approve more work or work on it a bit more, and then go back to the shared environment and kind of loop around it a little bit in a slightly different way. But, you know, in basics, it's the same collaborative workflow that we were talking about for, you know, in 2007. The other thing as well is down the side there you can see that we're talking about what's called CapEx. So CapEx really is meaning the capital expenditure. So the expenditure that's exhausted inside of a design project, the design and build process of a project. The next aspect, and PASS 1192-3, is talking about OPEX, which is the operational expenditure of a building. So we're then starting to lead into that project lifecycle management, handing over a CapEx designed building information model, and then the client having that to take into the operational part of that building, the project lifecycle of that building. And then obviously you've got that same 4-step process that's been kind of grayed out there with those sort of empty boxes there. And then at some point in that project's lifecycle, it might be being revamped, it might be being regenerated, and it would then revert back to going back up to the capital expenditure again, run through that same process as we've just discussed in the 1192-2, and then back down to this one again. So, you know, again, we're just trying to lead it into a bit more of a detailed analysis, really, that's all. I say the other two documents that's used a lot is the CIC BIM protocol, which is the one in the front there. That's just saying people are using this as now a kind of clip-on to their existing contract documents. The idea really is that it's got some fairly simple clauses. I think it's 10 clauses in there that basically clad onto your existing contract documents and just deal with the kind of collaborative working. It's fairly loose in some areas, but it's really kind of designed that way so that it can be pretty much adapted to any kind of design project. But you may need to start looking at it in detail and then eventually come up with some sort of addendum or something that's going to be a bit more specific to the practice that you're in. But it's a good way to start, and if you're using something like a kind of joint contract system anyway, so something like a JCT and NEC, then that alongside this CIC BIM protocol is probably going to be sufficient to start working with, really. You've also got the AIA BIM protocol, as I say there, which is really talking about standards when it comes to sort of inside of your office, really, if you like, how you're kind of rolling out BIM inside of the office. It's talking about standards of things like sort of templates and drawing standards and all that sort of stuff. So the AIA UK has a lot of stuff online for templates of different drawing packages, not just sort of Revit, which is the kind of Autodesk system, but other ones as well. So it's worth just looking at that. And then that's just the BIM assessments, the CPIX ones that I was talking about there. So I'm not going to go into those in too much detail. So I'm just aware that obviously time-wise, so I don't want to dwell too much. But I mean, this is more just talking about obviously the using things like BIM execution plans, which again, when you start on projects, obviously you will be doing things like BIM execution plans for each of those projects. And there's lots and lots of other bits of documents in there that you can see on the smaller bubbles there that sort of relate to all of those things. But to be honest, it's going to be a stage-by-stage thing. You're not just going to jump in to do everything that's on that page there. It's more a case of, as you kind of work things up, you will get involved in execution plans. That's going to probably have things then like an implementation plan before you start the project. And you probably will be using things like responsibilities matrix of who's producing what and when. And there's obviously various methods of that as well. This was really just highlighting that CapEx, OpEx thing that I was just talking about. So the capital expenditure, operational expenditure. In the middle here, you've got the kind of the project running along the RIBA stages, so 1, 2, 3, 4, and then obviously handover leading into 7 of operation there. This was really just to express as well alongside that you've got down the bottom here, you've got these little sort of nodes that pop out, so 1, 2, 3, 4 of the employer's decision points and the supply chain information exchanges. That's what I was referring to earlier as being data drops. So at each of those critical stages inside of the project design and construction, you would have a data drop that is just to then basically drop off the information to everybody involved, have a fixed point in time for that project and a kind of decision point for that part of the design. So, these are now sort of say that this is more the kind of CIC system at the bottom there, obviously working with the kind of IRBA new planner works. This was really just to express the kind of push-pull effect, the fact, a little bit like I was talking about with the capital projects right at the start with the government strategy, that obviously, yes, it was designed for large projects to start with, but that obviously had the knock-on effect that the design teams, the contracting teams inside of that then had supply chains. So not only was it large companies involved, it was then obviously feeding down to the smaller and smaller companies as it went. What's calling tiers in here, and each of those nodes obviously representing a different sort of contractor or subcontractor inside of that, all trying to kind of collaboratively work as you kind of go, really. I'll skip over that one because that's just talking about, it's important really to start talking about the level of detail, really. So level of detail and level of development are 2 different methods of basically trying to express how things are going to be drawn and what stages things are going to be required. So we have kind of 2 methods that we use. The LOD level of detail, which is detailed in the AIA BIM protocol that I put up there, which kind of talks about a grading. The GOG1 there is actually LOL1 as we use it, but the original system was Gs. Basically depicting that each of those data drops, you would have something drawn, so in this case, say the chair that's there, something that's drawn and modelled at a certain point in time at that data drop is going to be required to be at a certain level of detail. So on drop 1, it might be just a G1. Drop 2, later on in the project, it might be a G2 or a G3. So everybody's then in agreement as to what is expected of who when it comes to roles and responsibilities, and at which different points in the project, different levels of detail when it comes to modelled elements is going to then be required. So that's level of detail. The other method that people use now, which is becoming more adopted, I suppose, certainly from a manufacturer's point of view, is the level of development, which is based on the American Institute of Architects, the AIA standards. Still tends to be referred to as LOD, but it actually stands for level of development. And you can see in the bottom left of the picture there, we've got a kind of chart of LOD 100, 200, 300. So in respect, LOD 100 is like G1 or L1 that we was just looking at. G2, L2, is LOD sort of 200. So each of it doesn't differ that much really. It's a very similar thing, but it's more just that the reason that the AIA one's being adopted is because it's a bit more of a detailed system. That's all. It also has interim ones, so you can see there that it's got LOD 350. So the idea being that manufacturers particularly might need to produce a little bit more detail than it's got on 300, but not quite as much as a fully kind of detailed assembly that you might be producing for actual production drawings and that sort of stuff. So there is lots and lots of detail when it comes to these different things. The levels of detail for the AIA is also broken down in a lot more of a finite way for each individual part that you might be putting into a building, so things like walls, doors, windows, and at each of those relevant stages, LOD 100, 200, 300, what would be expected of those different parts. So there's lots of different methods that's used. And also, at the moment, just to make things more interesting, contractors are also coming up with their own standards for levels of development and levels of detail. So these aren't the only two that's used, but they are the two that's most widely adopted. So, but people do have a variation on a theme sometimes in there for contractors as well, sometimes have their own versions. This was just a quick one on manufacturing, really, just so that obviously, just to understand that obviously BIM these days is not just to talking about architects and engineers and things. It's also that manufacturers' details now are starting to be produced as it's sort of BIM ready, if you like, families, so that like here you can see things like, say, a door is going to be ready obviously to drop into a BIM model from a manufacturer. So the idea that that's coming with a lot more information inside of it, and that information can then be acquired, taken out into drawings in the same way that you would if it was 2D CAD information. You'd go to a manufacturer, maybe download something from their website of a kind of 2D detail. Well, now that's now been sort of moved into the kind of 3D environment, and manufacturers are now starting to have sort of BIM ready families available on the internet so that you can then download those and start populating models with them. And likewise, really, with manufacturing sort of component creation, obviously this was really just to express that there's a system in place. Down the bottom right there, you've got then sort of a component that contains a lot more data when it comes to, this is an electrical like PowerPoint unit that's put on the wall. So it's got the the distribution board inside of it, and then it's got the in out of all the different power supplies, so then it can be added into an actual electrical system by an M&E consultant. So there's a lot more detail in these parts, and then they can start being created into systems as you kind of go. Just the last few things I wanted to talk about today really was just how things have been translated as well. So at the moment, people are now using what's called IFC, or Industry Foundation Class. Things like those BIM assessment documents I was talking about earlier, obviously help people communicate what platforms they are using when it comes to technology, and it helps people understand how they can kind of translate those things between different technologies. But sometimes it is challenging if you do have people using different modelling software from different vendors, that sort of thing. Interoperability is the term that's sort of keyed around these days, and it's more relating to trying to make things universally accepted by different softwares into one another. So the idea of industry foundation class is basically to try and help with that link between different software vendors, basically. So Building Smart have produced help produce this kind of system, and it's been bought into by a lot of the leading software manufacturers. So obviously Autodesk being one of those, and the idea being that you can produce out of your BIM software an IFC file, and that IFC file can then be opened by pretty much anything else. And likewise, you could be bringing in an IFC file from any other produced software, and again, it's going to kind of work together. So it's just trying to make things a lot more shared, basically, in that kind of system. It's a free system. It doesn't you don't have to pay anything additional for it, and it's basically just reducing the computer modeled software data down to its kind of basic format to then make it easy to kind of link across. IFC are obviously being adopted a lot more now. People are sort of understanding it a little bit more. This is back to this kind of MBS report that I was talking about earlier. So just to sort of really say that obviously people are aware of what it is and starting to adopt it a little bit more. That kind of goes hand in hand with COBie as well. So COBie is it's a subset of IFC. And I mean the acronym, again obviously all about acronyms, the COBie acronym obviously stands for, as you can read across the top there, construction, operations, building information exchange. In basic terms, we're talking about the exchange of information between construction and operations. So really we're talking about moving from something that's designed as a model, constructed, and then obviously going to sort of handover and life cycle management. The idea of COBie really is to start talking about the facilities management of a project. When I was saying about the problem with facilities management earlier, and particularly when it comes to the life cycle management of a project, the problem with that is knowing what information is needed as an end result at the early stage of designing a project. The problem with that is that sometimes that information hasn't been placed inside of that, and the building information model doesn't contain all the information that it needs to. The idea of COBie is that you're putting some of that information in at an early stage, so that then when it does get handed over from construction through to operations, you can automatically acquire that information out, and you don't even need 3D software to read it. It's going to be able to exchange it out into, as you can see there, kind of spreadsheet, Excel kind of formats, and take out all the necessary information that you might need. So things like, serial numbers, part numbers, warranty information, for all the kind of parts that's been put inside of that building, so that then as a client, the owner of that building would then be able to look at that information once it's been handed over at the end of the construction process, and be able to acquire all the information on that building information model. Obviously, if they did have modelling software, they could then be updating that model through the kind of life cycle as well. COBie really utilises, as I say, it's just a subset of IFC. It utilises the same, export method that IFC uses, taking it down to kind of base computing language, and then obviously expressing it into, in this case, as I say, it would be the sort of spreadsheet format. But say COBie really is just a version of IFC, but the important thing with COBie is really an understanding of who's putting that information in when, and what information is required. again, that was just talking about COBie adoption really, and obviously, again, that there is an increase now year on year for people using it. Whether COBie is the final way that we express this information, I don't know. There's obviously talk about lots of different systems that's being put in place at the moment. And I can't say for definite that COBie is the way forward, because it might get changed into something else. But there's always going to be need for a system that does similar to basically what IFC and COBie does. Whether it ends up being called that and whether it finally ends up being that, it's very hard to know at the moment. And then lastly, data organisation really is obviously, as I started to say initially, that obviously BIM to me is more about kind of building information management. To me, part of the difficulty with an ever increasingly complex computer generated model is that obviously it contains more and more information inside of it. This was really just sort of a quick slide to express the fact that obviously organising that data can start to be, complex, and obviously, we are now starting to look at more and more ways of managing that data, and also being able to acquire the data out of the building information model that we need, rather than just being en masse a load of kind of stuff. So obviously the kind of top bit there. I'd suggest at the moment we're somewhere between the two middle ones there. We're not really anywhere near the actual finalised everything as we would kind of want it, nice and uniform. But we are starting to do obviously a lot more reporting and schedules nowadays with kind of BIM as we go. From a manufacturing point of view, people have used Project Vault. It's one way of organising data. So obviously manufacturers now have gone through the kind of virtual construction, and now they use, everything is all about data management for them. So we can kind of take a little bit of a learning curve out of what they've done, and begin to understand how they might have worked it. So now we are starting to look at things like Project Vault for starting to manage that data, being able to then pull out families as we might want them, schedule things as we might want them. So there's lots of ways again that we can start organising data, but this was just a very quick one just to sort of start to mention that obviously yes, it's fine having a building information model that's complex, but trying to organise that is sometimes difficult. And then lastly, really obviously, cloud-based technology as well is the other thing at the moment that's a big shift as well. So you've got in here I've put in things like field and glue. So what we're talking about here is really things that's on 360s. So 360 is Autodesk's kind of cloud system. The idea being that obviously you're just chucking something up to the cloud. It's there available for everybody in the kind of design team. They can download parts of it, look at it on things like mobile technology for pads and phones and things. Particularly useful for things like on site, where they might not have full BIM software. They might only have an iPad that's just got a very basic internet connection and not much else. So these programs allow it to then be communicated with them through the kind of internet cloud system. So again, there's a big move into trying to make things a lot more usable for people and making communication easier. And then obviously lastly, we're now starting to try and look at things like wearable technology, things like the old Google Glass up top there. I mean, with project lifecycle management, it would be great, if as a client you could eventually go around in your model in a virtual way and just sort of look at something and get all the information that you might need from that. It's something that we're kind of looking at now, and down the bottom there you've got mobile workstations as well. So obviously things like 3D scanning technology, point clouds, all of that sort of stuff is all coming into the fray now. And then computative BIM is the other bit that's in the middle there, which is sort of trying to talk about complex designs and working through complex designs through computer logic systems rather than necessarily just designing something. So obviously, yeah, there's a massive move into trying to use technology to a far greater degree than we probably are at the moment. So, but all these things obviously take time, and from my point of view, it's hard to keep up with everything at the moment. So it's but it's interesting where we're going. So and that's kind of it really. So that was everything I wanted to sort of touch on today. Obviously, I'm aware that some of it was a kind of whistle-stop tour with parts that you may want to explore in a lot more detail. So obviously, you know, feel free to kind of contact myself or you know, Adris, and we can try and supply any more information that you might need. I say the idea really was that I was going to leave the system open for kind of questions and stuff. So any questions that you've got, feel free to use the question system there. But other than that, obviously, thank you for joining me today, and I hope you found it useful. And thank you very much.